Communication and social change uses 7 models of communication, 7 models of communication. Many times throughout work in the social sciences, we find these divisions of concepts into, oftentimes the number is 4, but sometimes the number is 7, and so on. And dividing things this way, applying these principles of division, is not something we do because we're obsessed with certain numbers. So nothing is really special about the number 7 here. When we say we use 7 models of communication in this course, that's just a way of dividing up the world of communication to make it easier to think about. But if you're making your own personal typology of how to study communication, you could add to these models as you want. So if you want to make up additional models and write them in your notes, you could do that too. As long as you understand these 7 basic ones as sort of a starting point. So what I want to do today is make sure everybody understands each of these models and how it differs from the other models, and then to start using these models of communication to classify how we study communication in different ways and to promote some sort of divergent thinking from whatever standards you've already learned about how communication should be studied. Okay, here we go. So the first one that we will sort of evaluate here is our semiotic model. And semiotics is the part of communication studies that we take from linguistics. So the late 1800s, the work of especially French thinkers like Ferdinand de Saussure, but also American pragmatists like Charles Sanders Peirce, are informing communication studies from semiotics, from the study of signs. Semiotic questions have to do with the meanings of things, and they have to do with the relationships between things that are being used to signify or symbolize and the things that are being signified. So the relationships between signifiers and signified are central to the semiotic study of communications. The study of semiotics begins before people started using words like communication studies. So before there were communication theorists and before there were courses about communications, there were courses about semiotics. It's a precursor discipline to communication studies. Next one I should mention is the psychological study of communications, or you will find our textbook also referring to this as the psychosocial model, psychological or psychosocial model. And psychological thinking about communication ranges from behaviorist models, like the idea that if you reward somebody or if you reward some creature for doing certain things, it will repeatedly do those things. So that's a behaviorist way of thinking about psychology or of doing psychology. All the way to psychoanalytic theories. So some of the thinkers that you will find in the next reading from the textbook that you have, so the part about ideology, are thinking about the world in psychoanalytic terms, especially the thinker Slavoj Žižek, who you will find cited there, has a psychoanalytically informed perspective. So when we study communications in a psychological way, we're not just taking things that you learn in your psychology classes and bringing them over to communications, because that's a more mainstream form of psychology. So that's a way of trying to study in a sort of a positivist way what is happening factually in human brains. And by fact there, I mean a mainstream scientific consensus. We agree upon the methods of study and we agree upon the results of those studies. So fact-based psychology, such as one would learn in a psychology class here. That's only part of the psychology that finds its way into communication studies. The other part is this psychoanalytic theory, which is theoretical, it is speculative, and it thinks about, some might say, a sort of metaphysics of minds as they contemplate things. But in general, psychoanalytic theory is a way of generating concepts to reconfigure how we think about minds and how we think about internal communications, and maybe to affect some sort of social change as a result of that. As a result of thinking about our own minds differently, maybe we can make those minds produce changes in the world around us. So psychoanalysis and positivist psychology are both part of the psychological models that we involve. Psychoanalysis especially, and perhaps psychology a little bit more generally, tend to be opposed to the third model that I have here. So this is the phenomenological model. Phenomenological. Phenomena. It's a big word, comes from the Greek phenomenon. Pheno refers to the appearance of things. I believe the word also has a relationship, an ancient relationship with the word feeling. Pheno, the appearance of things as they come to you in your senses. So the idea of making something present or of representing things presupposes that something is coming to our senses. And phenomenology is the discussion of what we feel, what we see, hear, and so on. The reason that phenomenological thinking tends to come into conflict with psychological and especially psychoanalytic thinking is that to think about your senses, you have to somehow separate sensation from cognition, or from the other things that minds and the internal processes, the internal information processing functions of our bodies do. And some forms of psychology oppose that distinction. So it's not guaranteed that in the world our senses operate separately from our cognition. Rather, our cognition and the internal processes of our minds are constantly changing how our senses work. So to do a phenomenological study, we're kind of imposing an assumption that the senses can be separated from other things. And that's a useful assumption because it's good for descriptive purposes. If we are watching a music video or we are listening to a podcast or something like that, if we are constantly second-guessing ourselves, constantly trying to psychoanalyze ourselves and our own processes of analysis, we'll never get anywhere in our descriptions. So phenomenology is essential for describing things. If I ask you what happened when you are writing a report, even if it's something like a security report or something like that, you need to do a bit of phenomenology there where you set aside your assumptions about many parts of how the world works, and you just try to describe what you observed and encountered in that moment. That's kind of the art of phenomenology. Just try to describe what reached your senses in that moment. It's not an absolute way of getting truth about the world. It is a way of narrowing your focus to make your descriptions more clear. The socio-cultural model of communication is composed of approaches like I introduced this class with, like the circuit of culture. So the socio-cultural model hinges around this distinction that I'll come back to sort of remind you of a few times in the class, between culture and society. So society is our connections as a group, the society of this classroom, of this college, of this city, and so on. Any situation in which social agents, usually considered to be humans, although some ways of thinking about society also incorporate animals and robots and so on. But any situation in which social agents are intercommunicating with each other, they come into society. Whereas culture builds a sense of history and a sense of influence through time into things. So studying these two things together makes sense. We think of socio-cultural, instead of just sociology of communication or cultural studies of communication, thinking about these two things together makes sense because pretty much any method that you use to study one of these things will also involve elements of the other. If you're interviewing somebody about their biography, they will be telling you constantly about other people that they relate to. And they'll be involving elements of society, but also they'll be involving elements of their history and culture. Those two things won't be separable from each other. Similarly, if you are looking into the meanings of a piece of media, you won't be able to completely separate those meanings from its history. And you won't be able to completely separate those meanings from the people that are the intended audience of that piece of media. So society and culture are kind of inextricable from each other, so they come together in this word for this model of communication studies that approaches them both. Cybernetic is a word that oftentimes people have not encountered before this course. Cybernetics, cybernetic. This is one of the more interesting parts of the course, though, from a pop culture perspective, because cybernetics has been hugely important both in this region of the world and in general in popular culture today. Cybernetics is the root of the word Cybertruck, for example, or the video game Cyberpunk 2077. These trace back to this idea of cybernetics. Cybernetic comes from a Greek word kubernetikos. I think I'm pronouncing it right there. But this Greek word refers to the act of steering a ship or otherwise controlling a system. It's related to the word to govern. So cybernetics is the study of controlling systems and controlling the flow of those systems. Before this way of thinking that was cybernetics, people had much less understanding of the idea of a feedback loop. So for example, if you go to a concert and someone plugs in an instrument such as an electric guitar or something like that, or they take a microphone and they point it at an amplifier, oftentimes you hear this shrieking feedback sound for a moment until the sound technicians get control of it. And that sound happens when a signal is sent out of a loudspeaker, then captured by a recording device, and then sent back through the same loudspeaker. The result is that the signal becomes louder and louder. This is a feedback loop. And thinking about feedback loops is extremely important in reference to any sort of electronic media, but also at a large scale, like our climate. Our climate and how our bodies work, and how any living thing works, is the result of many intertwined feedback loops. One of them, for example, would be something like the water cycle, where water evaporates and then rains down on us, but also things like the carbon cycle that affect global warming and so on. The study of cybernetics is well equipped to study these huge systems. And in communication studies specifically, cybernetics is essential for understanding things like what we call echo chambers. So the idea that if you get a group of people to only talk with other people who already agree with them, they tend to amplify each other's ideas and sometimes produce ideas that to the rest of the world seem insane. And that's because that group has entered into a feedback loop where they just promote each other's ideas to become more extreme, but also more different from the ideas of the outside world. Cybernetic understanding of communication. Rhetorical ways of thinking about communication go back to the origins of philosophy, of discussion of any sort of techniques of persuading other people. Rhetoric here, another Greek word. This comes from the idea of being an orator, someone who speaks, or the word rhetor referred eventually to teachers of oration skills, teachers of speaking skills. Rhetoric means to use communication to get what you want. So rhetoric refers to the persuasive aspect of communication. If you are doing rhetoric, you are studying or teaching or practicing the art of strategically designing how you communicate to achieve some goal. That's why rhetorical studies have been with us for as long as philosophy of communication has existed, and they will continue to persist throughout communication studies for the foreseeable future, because always we're trying to persuade somebody of something else. Whether that persuasion is to get someone else to hire us for a job, or to get a high grade, or if that persuasion is some more complex thing that has to do with politics and cultural views and so on. Always we're engaged in some sort of persuasion throughout our lives, so rhetorical study is the study of that. In practice, rhetoric is often expressed in terms of structures, like how to structure an essay for greatest effect, but it also applies to how to design images and how to use body language and other things related to that. Rhetoric is a more expansive field than you often hear about it discussed in academics. So I'll try and incorporate elements of rhetorical thinking when we're talking about video, for example. Not to go all the way into film studies land, but also to get us thinking about how rhetoric manifests across multiple modalities of communication. And then critical studies of communication are the studies that find problems with the other studies. So when we're thinking about any one model of communication, it always has something wrong with it. I mentioned, for example, that phenomenology sacrifices some of what is sometimes called the depth psychology or the depth analysis of things to focus instead on describing what happens for our senses. So that's a sacrifice, it's a limitation of phenomenology. And that's something that critical studies will be attentive to. So if you are writing about a phenomenological study from a critical perspective, you will note those limitations. And as a result, you will probably speculate about what that study might have missed, what it might not be aware of. Similarly, psychological studies of communication often miss specific, person-specific details. So if you are studying the experiences of, say, 3,000 people with a certain television or advertising program, you will need to aggregate the information from all those people somehow. So if you have 3,000 people filling out a survey or answering a survey or something like that, and then you are taking those results and presenting them somewhere else, you're going to sacrifice person-specific details like the person's mood at the time when they were consuming this television program. Maybe some people only watch a certain television program while they are using a certain type of drug or something like that. And always a large psychological study will omit some of these details for the sake of getting the most factually agreeable result possible. And that's fine, scientific studies need to do that. However, the role of critical studies is to, again, figure out what those limitations are and figure out new ways of talking about them. Sometimes so that limitations can be overcome in the future, but also sometimes so that we just continue to be aware of our limitations.